let me nuance that a little and say that before and after the Soviet era, and I'm not necessarily looking to refute your point because I was kind of making it myself 2 minutes ago, but the czars and Putin, who now styles himself to be today's czar, essentially had the same attitude towards their people. Now, is it on the same level? Here's what's interesting. I would say in pre-Soviet times, it wasn't on quite the same level. But I would say in Putin's Russia, it very much is. And yet, you yourself have shown me one of the most horrifying propaganda posters I've ever seen of Vladimir Putin appropriating the icon of the Virgin to glorify Russian nationalism and the invasion and conquest of a neighboring state. So what would we say? Because all three phases of Russian history, this is kind of in some ways a Russian problem, except that we see the Germans do it, we see the Vietnamese do it, we see lots and lots of very non-Christian or semi-Christian regimes do this. So we have a phase where the Tsar is seen as kind of a saint in the Orthodox canon. We have a completely atheistic regime, and we have a man who at least appropriates the Orthodox tradition to the degree that he fragments international orthodoxy over his invasion. So how do we nuance our argument about this? Or do we attribute other factors came into play in especially Putin's case?
Well, yes, we have to nuance it. But what I would say is you see a taking of the form of Christianity, but gutting the gospel from it. And so, therefore, you're able to take the empty doll or the desiccated corpse of Christianity and use it to your whim. It's something kind of like Simon the magician, who sees the apostles in a city, and it's like, give me this power that you have. He wants the power that the faith has, but he doesn't want the bedrock of, the silly stuff about loving your enemies and dying to self, and all that nonsense and all the difficult stuff that makes it kind of annoying to have to deal with this this belief system. So I would say that you have you see the same thing in the Borgia church, or the Avignon papacy. A lot of the
just to clarify, can you briefly define those for any listeners that aren't?
I would say they're the example of the Catholic Church being solely or almost solely focused on secular and earthly goods and desires. Not to get into the kind of the nuances.
Right. But okay, just to be
yeah. I'd say it's the same thing. Or you're taking the form of Christianity and you're using that, but you'll notice it's the same thing as Stalinism in a way where you're pushing Christ out of the center of the social discourse.
So you would say that covers Putin for sure.
Yes.
Would you say that the same thing happened in Imperial Russia before the Soviet era?
I would say that you had a higher likelihood of meeting genuine Christians because, I think that's why the Lord cast the net so wide. There's because you'd catch so many different types of fish. And if you're catching 100 fish, then 5 might be worthy of, the table. But if you're catching 5 fish, it's a lot more likely that you're going to get smaller numbers of true, authentic disciples. I'm kind of mixing metaphors here. But anyway, the point I'm making is you're more likely, but it also is a similar thing with a lot of those state religions, is you get a lot of the form of Christianity without necessarily the substance or the heart of the faith, because it's a lot more difficult to deal with authentic Christianity when you're not undergoing some sort of exterior force. Christianity doesn't do well in comfort, but that is where a lot of us are kind of at to practice the faith. We live in places that we're not going to get murdered for the faith or anything like that, but it's kind of that incessant need to go into oneself, and from there, let the Spirit move where he will.
So we're talking about the spiritual kingdom as opposed to the earthly kingdom. And obviously from a Catholic perspective, that's more complicated than it is for a whatever I am at this point. Reformed, derived, adjacent, Protestant-ish. But to take this back to the early part of church history, we can see at the foundation, and I should mention every emperor and monarch from the days of Emperor Constantine onwards that we're about to get into based their claim and modeled themselves in one way or another directly on the Caesar Constantine. You have the Tsar, Caesar, you have the Kaiser, you have, to some degree or another, Napoleon called himself the Emperor of the French, just as the Caesar called himself the Emperor of the Romans. It's a very conscious Western tradition. And Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century was one of several, 3 or 4 contenders. This is a time when the Roman Empire had essentially imploded its political culture. To summarize this briefly, military units decided it became a banana republic, we would call it today, where the military got the idea that they could make Caesars and break them at whim. And you had 60 Caesars in 70 years in the 3rd century. It was epically dysfunctional. Diocletian comes in, weaves it back together by sheer force, but now he is, instead of the servant of the people, as Augustus and the good emperors presented themselves to be, the good, quote unquote, at least by earthly standards. Now he was an unapproachable figure. People groveled before him as a result of the political culture decaying to the degree that the way Caesars got offed was to let people get too close to them. So they just kind of wove the ideology, the politics, the history, the court all together. Diocletian dies, his tetrarchy system collapses. The 4 men he appointed to succeed him and his co-rulers all turn against each other. One of them is Constantine. He battles his way to the top. The trick with Constantine, and no one really has any idea what actually happened with him. His supposed conversion to Christianity determined the course of Western history, almost single-handedly. Because you hear different stories about it. If you take the prevailing narrative, he got a sign that he thought was Christ in the sky saying, "Conquer by this sign." And he went out on the Milvian Bridge and he smashed his enemies, and then he attributed it to Jesus. Didn't stop worshiping the unconquered Son for decades. Got kind of confused about theology, thought that you could actually hang on to baptism until the end of your life just to make sure you're okay, which you and I would probably both agree on is a bad idea, despite our conflicting views on baptism.
Right.
Was kind of a typical, Adrian Goldsworthy says, my favorite Roman historian, says, more than anything, he was just a typical Roman emperor. But from that point on, he legalized Christianity, called the Council of Nicaea, which everyone would agree was providential because it settled the Trinity as basically the default for the Western Church and the Eastern Church forever.
Yeah.
But the scary part was that the implication of the emperor convening a church council was that now the church is kind of, at best, in a symbiotic relationship with the state, and at worst, kind of subjugated to the state. And that set the pattern. With the collapse of the Western Empire, you didn't have any emperor that could do that singularly anymore. Charlemagne tried, but it was kind of a joke. In the East, that carried on exactly as set by Constantine. And that was the origin of this. So we have this place where I don't personally think Constantine ever knew Christ. Nothing in his life demonstrates it. Even setting aside questions of baptismal salvation and such, there's nothing in his life to say that he ever stopped thinking like a Roman pagan. But that's the beginning. That's the origin of it. So that was a lot. So what are your general thoughts and reactions to that train of thinking?
Well, it's a good exemplar of the fact that theology does have an impact concretely in the world, and the questions that we are posing do matter. They really do matter. For example, I mean, the closest Orthodox church to me, which is 10 minutes away, is called Saints Constantine and Helen Orthodox Church. So that's ironic enough. That shows you that, you know, three different people can have three different views of a political figure. In the case of the East, he's a religious figure. I mean, you know, that's an interesting thing. But it does matter. It does impact politics, and it does impact the way we live our lives. And so the basis of our life is going to be based on the question of the existence of God. Now, other things are going to be involved, but it really is day and night. And I mean, you can do something like agnosticism, but you kind of have to pick a way to live life that either is going to track along a Christian or an atheistic path. But it's kind of impossible in this post-Christian or this post-Christ world to remain neutral about this question.
By the way, I didn't put that together. I forgot they say that in the East. Any Orthodox listeners out there, I didn't mean to unduly offend. But I mean, I can't withdraw the point because it's like the foundation of Western history from that point on.
Yeah.
So you can't understand how we got to this place where we are, this dynamic, this church-state dynamic, which America was founded as an attempt to, I would say, nuance that more than reverse it. Because the original idea wasn't this 100% separation of church and state that the secular worldview tries to promote today. And to be clear, I love the American idea. I am a separation of church and state man to the core. But what the framers meant was to get away from what Constantine had started, to get away from the union of the church and the state. So the state is funding the church, the state is the church, or the emperor can convoke councils, etc., etc. I mean, they broke away from an empire. The American founders broke away from an empire where the king was essentially the head of the church. And one of the English kings in the 16th century had essentially declared himself to be a new pope and made a church out of it. Right. So I like this. I like this place we're in. And I would say, though, that as they said during World War II, freedom doesn't come for free. And sadly, when you don't have the ability to use the force of the state to impose external morality on people, yeah, sin is like the law of thermodynamics. It's just going to corrupt humanity. And if it's not forced to stay artificially in a certain condition, a certain state of decay, it's going to keep decaying. And that probably is where we're at, have been heading to.